Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Tirant. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
Welcome to this episode of the Disrupt Your Career podcast. I'm really happy to be welcoming back after a longish summer break, Isabel Berwick. Isabel is a long-time prize-winning journalist and editor with a very illustrious career at the Financial Times, and who has developed a particular penchant for all things work and career related. And she's the recent author of a book that was published earlier this year called The Future Proof Career. Just the kind of thing we love. Isabel, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Claire.
Wonderful. Let's start, as we always do, with your career journey. You've been through several pivots in your own career, working on many different aspects of work at the Financial Times, ever creating new angles, and including your own podcast, the FT's Working It, and covering a multitude of topics to date. You've also had this book recently published. Why don't you talk us through this extraordinary career? Tell us how it unfolded. Was it design, serendipity? What are you most proud of? And what were the moments of biggest challenge?
It is pretty accidental, some of it. So I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I went straight to journalism college, pretty much from university. So I've been in journalism since the early 90s, actually. But I've been at the FT for just over 20 years. And I've done lots of jobs. I started off as a reporter. So I was a specialist in personal finance, and then I switched over to editing. So I've been an editor on a lot of what we call desks at the FT. I've been on FT Weekend. I edited Lunch with the FT for a while, our big flagship interview. I've worked on the books desk. I have commissioned big name pieces from very famous people. And then I swapped into the opinion desk. So essentially geopolitics, finance, all that stuff on the daily opinion pages in the FT, which is an incredible job. And I was working there for Brexit, Donald Trump's election. So I've seen some extraordinary things. And then in about 2018, I moved over to work on the work and careers section at the FT. I'm going to be honest, I didn't want to do that. I was asked to do that by the then editor of the paper to help someone out who was then editing, who needed some support. And that actually was the kind of most extraordinary break, because it wasn't something that I knew I wanted. And I found it very difficult the first year because I was number two. And I suppose one of the things I've learned from my career is that I find it quite hard to take orders from people who are not collaborative. I think the quality of one's manager is so important. Anyway, eventually I took over. I became the editor. It was my show and I loved it. And then another enormous stroke of fate, really. We were going to launch a podcast about work. I said, I'll have a go. And I did it alongside my job, which almost drove me around the bend. I was working pretty much 7 days a week, but it was worth it. And I think sometimes we have those moments in our careers where we have to go above and beyond. And as the younger people would say, break our boundaries. But it was so worth it in order to get to where I am now, where I'm host of a podcast. I write a newsletter also called Working It. I wrote a book on every Saturday for a year in my spare time. And I am just filming a series of videos for Working It as well. So I've moved completely into audio newsletters and video, which are essentially future-facing parts of journalism. Journalism can often be quite challenging, but these are all growth areas, and it's been a fantastic learning curve.
It really sounds as though what you've done is build your own multi-channel brand within the FT brand and created a little, well, not little, but an inner module of itself.
The word intrapreneur is perhaps a little bit extravagant for what I've done. It wasn't originally my idea, but I think I just embraced the opportunities that were there, even though it was quite scary to go so far out of my comfort zone.
Fantastic. Well, as you know, what we reach for in life is unknown difficulty and the benefits of the challenge of big disruptive moves. So the fact that you managed to create this within one organization is what I'm loving here, because most people, whether they're doing it actively or passively, end up needing to go elsewhere to get these big kinds of changes. But you've done it all while inside the one place, which is fantastic. Very interesting.
Well, kudos to my employer.
Yes. Well, sounds like a great combination. You referred a little way in there to the difficulties of different types of leadership, how compatible we are, and so on. So I'm wondering what particular leadership or other leadership and management type lessons you've learned through working in journalism. You know, we don't usually have people here on this podcast from your field. They're typically academics or people and talent leaders from corporations. And I've got a particularly personal angle on this question as I ponder what it might have been for me if I'd actually pursued my particular teenage and student year plans of becoming a journalist. Completely another story, but I'd love to hear how you perceive the leadership lessons that you've been learning through all these years.
I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think journalism is a career that a lot of people are interested in. It's an attractive and fun career. And what can I tell you? I have never been bored one day of my life. It's not a lucrative career, particularly. One can make a lot more money in corporate life. But I think if you can make it in journalism, it offers something quite unique. And how I would describe it is a sort of distillation of enormous amounts of information down to whatever it is that you believe the readers need to hear. And it's very much about your audience. And that's what we need to not lose sight of as we move into this extraordinary age of disinformation and fast-moving events. In terms of internal, so that's the external part of being a journalist, which I have always found 100% rewarding. Internally, working in a big media organization, I've worked in several, is like any other organization. It is dysfunctional. And I think the particular challenge for media organizations is that they were very old-fashioned for a very long time. So the hierarchy of a newspaper has the editor at the top, and it still does. And that hasn't changed. Though what has changed is the way that we work has changed, the diversity of the workforce has changed, the way that we report things has changed. And I think for the most challenging part of my career was when my children were small, probably at the, in the noughts, the beginning of this century. So the world was changing quite fast outside. So things like job shares, part-time work, very common in the corporate world. Inside a national newspaper, not so much. And I had a terrible time. I actually had a breakdown and didn't tell anybody about it because I was forced out of a job because I was part-time. My career stalled for a long time. And I think now that just wouldn't happen. And so although that was a very challenging time for me, I clung on tenaciously to my job. And there have been times when I've thought, should I have walked away? Because it was awful. I was in a very bad way and I had terrible managers. And, at that time, it was not the FT particularly, but across the media, this is not a place for part-time women. It's a very hard charging job and we work very long hours. There was no bandwidth to allow different types of working. And it is the great joy of my career now to see that women and men who choose to work flexibly can have amazing careers in the media and live a very balanced life as well. It's still a long hours culture. It's still hard, but the management has transformed and that is fantastic. But in other respects, it's just like any other organization. One's experience of work is almost entirely down to one's direct line manager. And that is something that I think doesn't change at all in my experience. And from talking to hundreds of people on my podcast, companies can make all the great pronouncements they like about how they work and corporate culture. But if you've got a crappy manager, that is going to be your experience of work.
Indeed. Crappy leadership is a very common phrase in my particular lexicon and how we should be getting rid of it. But yes, it takes a while. What would you say is the biggest shift you made in terms of the roles you've played in your career? And what would you think about the way you played through that disruptive change and the challenges of it?
I suppose the biggest change was becoming a podcast host. which I think a lot of journalists go into audio thinking it's very similar. It is similar in some respects, but many respects not at all. There's partly the skill set of being a podcast host, which is a lot more about listening than it is for a reporter. Often when you are reporting or editing, you have an idea of what it is that you want to see or read, or the point you're wanting your interviewee to make, and you will get there. And it is quite extractive. So it's a transactional thing. I think often in audio, we listen. I do have questions that I want to ask. I do have points I want to hit. It's more expansive and it's less transactional. So there's that. And then there's the technical side of being an audio host, which I also had to learn. I wasn't very good to start off with. I think the best tip I had from my first producer, who's gone on to incredible success with 2 seasons of a series called The Girlfriends, which I commend to everybody. Feminist true crime, really. She would jump up and down in the studio and say, talk to me like I'm your friend in the pub. And so the difference between audio and the BBC is the difference between talking to a friend and talking to the nation. And that, I think, is a distinction that a lot of podcast hosts still don't get. So there's the intimacy. So essentially, I flipped from being an impersonal part of the FT machine and everything that big brand gives us, which is a quality and a rigor. And I put myself in front of that brand almost and said, I'm a brand, I'm a mini sub-brand. I am a person and I'm giving some of myself in a way that I never did as an editor or a reporter. So I suppose that's the biggest difference. And that comes with enormous upsides, but also some challenges in terms of how much of yourself you're putting out there, how authentic, inverted commas, is it? All of that stuff, which anyone in a slightly out-facing role it'll resonate with them, I think.
Absolutely. Funnily enough, I just did a post on LinkedIn about an hour before we spoke today about authenticity and how difficult that balance is of, do you show absolutely everything in your creation of connection? Very tough, but fascinating, and endless opportunities to play with it in a podcast that you're doing weekly. Wonderful. Good. So if we cast our minds now towards the young people of today who are thinking about what they want to do with their careers and how to get started, what advice would you give them based both on your personal learning and on all the other people that you've been connected with and conversing with over these years?
What I wish I'd known is that the first thing might not be the best thing or the last thing. You don't have to make a decision. And for most people, careers are a mixture of intention and chance. And you can make your own chances to a certain extent through things like networking, connection, getting out there a little bit. But actually, we're all works in progress. So are our careers. So, of course, lots of young people go into the professions. They go into jobs that require rigorous training. But if you're a person who hasn't chosen that kind of path, which is structured for you, my own children are in this situation, I would just say be kind to yourself and follow a path that seems right to you. And something may emerge, something may not emerge. A lot of people get to 30 now and feel directionless, or even younger. The quarter life crisis is a real thing at 25. One is a long time working and increasingly longer. If you're under 30 now, you might be working until you're 80. So just give yourself a little bit of leeway. I was desperate when I saw people who were my age, who had been contemporaries, on television, in the national papers. And I was still toiling away, writing about doctors' computer systems, traveling around the country, visiting GPs. I was really miserable about it. And actually now I look back and think that was a really formative experience. It taught me how to talk to anybody. I would go into these doctors' surgeries and I would be immersed in their day-to-day lives. And it was a real privilege. And I wouldn't swap that for the world, actually.
Unexpected benefits, definitely. All right, let's get specifically to your book, The Future Proof Career, which published earlier this year. What was your motivation to write it, and what need are you trying to address with the book?
My motivation to write it was that HarperCollins asked me to.
How very lovely.
So I didn't have to punt my book idea around. I was very lucky. An editor at HarperCollins was a fan of the podcast and sent me a DM on Twitter asking me if I'd like to write a book. Yes, I would. So I wrote the book. When I was conceiving what I was going to write about, they were very open to what they wanted. And I looked at all the existing books, and I have hundreds on my desk. And I thought, you know what? I just want something that is like a primer for people who want to enjoy work as part of a fulfilling life, who want to get on with their colleagues, who want to advance in their career. So it's essentially a one-stop shop. So I'm not pretending to cover everything. I'm just saying, if you're buying a book and you're not a natural business book buyer, this book will help you in lots of different areas of your career. It's a book to help people make work better. And actually, one of the things that I hadn't thought about, but people have told me, is that it has helped them reflect on whether they want to stay in their job. So I've had several people talk to me and message me saying, I read the chapter on auditing your workplace and I realized that my workplace was toxic or not the right one for me. So it's either a practical tool or a reflective tool, depending, I guess, on where you are. Sorry, that's quite a waffly answer.
No, it's great. That's great. Good. Let's get down to some basics around the book. Of course, it contains stories and advice and guidance, all the aspects of how to navigate modern day careers, things like 4-day work week, quiet quitting, whatever. There's lots of it. Obviously, we want our listeners to read the book. So without giving away the whole thing, could you boil down the main ideas of the book and just share a little bit about each one with us?
It's divided into two parts. First half is for staff and the second half is for managers. And I did that because obviously we're employees, and this is a book really for people in organizational structures. If you're a self-employed person, there will be stuff in there, but it's not primarily aimed at you, as the podcast is pretty much a corporate podcast. We're all members of staff or employees, but we're often also managers. How we interact with other people depends on which role we're playing. So when you're in the manager role, there's a certain way you have to behave. And so in that half of the book, I've got a lot of information on how to run a team inclusively, how to get on with people you don't like, how to talk to people above you in the hierarchy, how to pitch an idea, and how to know when to move up or move across. So your career may not be a straight line upwards. The more general staff part of the book, I start off with a kind of overview of the way work is now and offer to people to audit their own workplace, looking at different things that might suggest whether it's a healthy workplace in all respects, and balancing home life and work life. Some of the themes that have come out of the pandemic that have stuck with us, actually. And I think we probably are now in a place where if you have an office 3 days a week is probably where it's going to stick, there or thereabouts. So some stuff reflecting on how to make yourself more visible at work if you're not present 5 days a week, which is a big and I think increasing issue for workplaces. Some people call it personal branding, some people call it visibility, but I think this increasing acknowledgement that you're not top of mind for your manager, your career is not top of their mind, so you have to take care of yourself. And perhaps I think in the past, a lot of us, and I know I was guilty of this, I don't know about you, I was waiting for my employer to praise me and move me and see how great I was. And yes, occasionally that happened, but generally we have to be a little bit more proactive about ourselves. And I hope my book helps people just to begin that journey without turning into hideous self-promoters.
Beautiful. I love that. You describe the book as addressing the needs of ordinary people who don't necessarily want to become a CEO. I think that, of course, covers, 99% of the world, probably. And you have a beautiful notion of squidginess of careers in terms of much more how we work and not just what we do for work. For anyone listening, could you elaborate a bit on this squidginess thing and maybe share a couple of examples and tips?
It's slightly different from squiggly careers, which is, a lot of people will know, the Helen and Tucker and Sarah Ellis from Amazing If have done this incredible work around educating people that work doesn't have to be a straight linear line upwards. We can move sideways, etc. I think squidginess is slightly different in that it's not defined in a way that we wish it was. So we look to our employers to give us structure, to give us progression, to give us transparency. In a real world, that isn't really happening. So I guess it's about embracing the imperfect in search of balance and fulfillment. And I think for far too many of us, work previously, we place so much responsibility on our employer. We can't do that anymore. So the squidginess of the post-pandemic world is uncertain. There's a lot more uncertainty, but with that brings possibility. So the squidginess, it's riskier, it's uncertain. Your career path may not be clear. Your manager may be crappy, but squidginess allows us to reinvent aspects of what work means to us. And I think this is a macro issue. A lot of surveys, things like the Edelman Trust Survey, things like that have shown that what people want from work is changing, and they want something that's kind of meaningful to them. And into the imperfection of squidge, we can place our own ambitions. And I kind of think we can make it how we want to make it. I mean, maybe this is slightly delusional, I don't know, but even within a corporate setting, there are many things you can do to take a bit of control.
Often when I work with clients, I ask them if they've already asked for the thing they want. And typically they haven't. So they actually have done the work of figuring out what they want, but they haven't gone out to ask for it. And I think therein is the beauty of the squidge that you're talking about. There are things that we can mold. There are things that we can shape. But of course, part of it is knowing what we want to shape. And that's where perhaps as generations go on and situations change, there's more knowing, more self-awareness. And then there's the, how do you go about looking for it, making it happen? And certainly we've moved away from the stage where we get it handed to us on a silver platter. And then there's the gap between no silver platter and doing nothing. And that sounds like the squidge that you're describing.
Yeah, and it can be a good squidge or a bad squidge, depending on how you adapt to it. But it requires action in a way that it didn't probably even 10 years ago.
Action with a bigger potential gain, if taken. Beautiful. I'm thinking about all the different people you've come across in your work around careers. And obviously you've made your own big pivots, but we've talked about those to some extent. Can you think of any particularly good examples of others, whether it's an individual handling a significant career transition, or whether it's an organization proposing and facilitating one? It would be wonderful to hear just an example or two of those that you think have done particularly well or continue to do particularly well in this transition area.
That's really interesting. So I have a former colleague called Michael Skopinka, who was at the FT for a very long time and wrote about management. So probably some of the listeners will know his name. And during the latter part of his time, he started to think about what I want to do next. And he started to train as a counsellor and completed that training after he'd left the FT. But he's been able to integrate that work with his vast knowledge of journalism and management. And he'd been a corporate reporter for many years. He knows how corporates work. So he's now able to bring the past into his new career with one-on-one clients and with corporate clients. So that's a very sort of journalistic transition. Last year at the FT Festival, I interviewed a woman who'd been a very senior corporate lawyer, and she was training as a midwife. And this type of career transition, and there's also my colleague Lucy Calloway, who left the FT to become a teacher. So I think career transitions to something very different are becoming increasingly popular and common. And I'm interested to know why that is. I'm going to try and delve more into it. But the idea of the mid to late career transition or pivot, I think is going to be one of the issues of the next 5 years. I'm really excited about it. I think LBS has started a course on this. I know Stanford and Harvard have. There's the Modern Elder Academy in the US. If you look on LinkedIn, there's a lot of content around transition. And that's your area of focus. But for many people, it can often be something like, I've been pushed out, so I'm going to be a consultant in the same area. And I think what we're going to see more of is, my friend who left being a lawyer to become a midwife. We now have permission for more radical transitions, I think.
Definitely.
And I'd really like to see it. So I guess that's an imperfect answer. In terms of organizations transitioning, I have just interviewed for my video series the CEO at Ricoh, Nicola Downing. And Ricoh is a Japanese tech company, very well known for printed photocopiers. It has transitioned into workplace tech much more generally, sort of, more online applications. And what they have done, which I was incredibly impressed by, was that they have provided a very bespoke leadership course in association with Oxford Said for their clients. So the leaders in their clients' companies are offered this extraordinarily high-end leadership course. And Ricoh sends some of its own leadership people on these courses too. But I just thought, what an imaginative and innovative way. Firstly, the business is transforming, and secondly, they're transforming leadership, both for themselves and their clients. It's a very generous spirited and interesting idea. I think that's the most innovative one I've come across recently.
That's pretty extraordinary, actually, and I hadn't heard about it at all. We'll definitely be delving into that, but that the potential for creating true collaboration through that, as you say, very big investment in time, money, and energy is extraordinary. And yes, who knows if that is going to be the start of many similar ways of doing things, but that's a wonderful story to be thinking about. I'd like to go back to you now. And you said if you'd known at the beginning that you didn't have to get it fully right on your career from day one, that's one thing. What other advice would you want to give to 18-year-old Isabel? How would you want to reassure her or inspire her for the rest of her life?
Well, it's interesting we talk about this because I was reading I kept a diary assiduously as a young woman and actually as an older woman. And the idea that I had of myself as a young employee was very different from the reality of it. I was quite bad, actually. I was constantly falling asleep at my desk because I went out too much. I was really disengaged. I was bored. I mean, there was no internet, so it was boring. But now looking back, I think I wish I had been kinder to myself, maybe, but also paid more attention, read the room, taken a step back. I got very uptight very quickly because I didn't, nobody was inviting me out for lunch. I wasn't on the in jokes. They were all friends with each other and I was on the outs. To go into a workplace for the first time where you're the new person in an established organization, as many grad trainees may be, unless they're in a big cohort or anybody would be. I just wish I had calmed down and observed rather than expecting to be a participant. And I think part of that is youth and part of that is my character, which is extrovert. But I think I have learnt to temper that with age and wisdom. It was striking how shockingly poor I was as a grad trainee at Haymarket Medical. So I apologise to anybody who had to work with me in the early 1990s.
This is the first time we've had a public apology on this podcast, but I love it.
So yeah, observe, actually. And I think that doesn't come naturally to especially young people who are used to having their voices heard. I know that wasn't a particular way we would have phrased it back then, but I was let's be honest, a young woman who'd been to private school in Oxbridge. I came from a pretty well-off background. I had used to being listened to.
And to being the centre of your own universe.
And being the centre of my own universe. And to go into a big operation where you're a tiny, tiny cog, I think came as a bit of a shock. And I think young people now are much better equipped for that because they can see what the world of work is like on the internet every day. Come to work with me videos are huge. My kids have never worked in a corporate environment, but they certainly know what one looks like. But I do think that advice about observing is useful at any point in our careers, and I wish I'd learned it earlier.
I could say exactly the same about mine, but that's not what we're here for. What's your most exciting project on the next 6-month menu for you?
Well, I'm doing quite a lot of speaking. I am really enjoying making videos, which is not something I've ever done before. So that's a whole new skill set. I am hoping we will have a paperback of the Future Proof Career next year. And I am hoping I will be able to write an extra chapter about generative AI, because that has changed. It changes every month, really, doesn't it? I mean, it's just a snapshot in time. What else? On a personal level, I guess, I'm getting divorced. It's not something I ever expected would happen to me. I've been married for 27 years. My children are grown up. I have come to a sort of unexpected turn in my personal life, I suppose. So that's something that impacts every area of my life in a way that brings a lot of uncertainty, but also potential.
Thank you for your candor. Isabel, it's been an absolute pleasure having you with me today. Thank you so much. Wow, what a range of things we've covered, which I wasn't necessarily expecting to get to, but thank you for that. It was beautiful.
Oh, it's lovely to meet you, Claire. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.